Welcome to Dialogues at Fulcrum, where we have conversations with experts and analysts on the latest geopolitical, economic, and cultural developments in Southeast Asia.
Good morning to our listeners and welcome to Dialogues at Fulcrum. I'm Julia Lau, coordinator of the Indonesia Studies Programme at IC's Yusof Ishak Institute. I'm also one of the editors for Fulcrum, IC's commentary and analysis website. With me today is Dr. Ian Wilson, a former visiting fellow at ICES. Ian is trained as a political sociologist. He is now Associate Dean, Research, and a senior lecturer at Murdoch University in Australia in the School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. Ian is also a principal fellow at his university's Indo-Pacific Research Center. He has close to 3 decades of research experience on Indonesia and other issues and focuses on the relationship between power, violence, and representation. Welcome, Ian.
Thanks, Julia. It's great to be back at ICES.
Welcome and selamat datang to ICES in Singapore. It is very timely that we are talking to you. This is about a month and a half after we saw the huge violent protests spreading across Indonesia in late August. And as we hit the first anniversary of the Prabowo Subianto administration's taking over power or taking office. And a large part of your own research over the years has been the relationship between power, violence, and representation, as you put it, in Indonesian politics and society. So we'll start with this question, which is a complex one. How would you characterize this relationship under Prabowo's administration or leadership today, given what we've seen happen in Indonesia just in the past year?
Sure. Well, look, I might maybe start with talking about the protests that we saw in August, and sort of talk through your question maybe through that to start off with. I mean, the protests were kind of interesting in a couple of ways. Well, firstly, that what started as protests led by the usual suspects in terms of organised protests in Indonesia, that's university students and labour, were met with some quite repressive responses from the police. And so there was significant, arguably violence from state institutions, including in particular the killing or the death of Arifan Kurniawan, the delivery driver who was hit and killed by a police car. And that saw really a triggering of violence throughout the country in terms of protests that were violent in the sense of not indiscriminate looting, which is something that we saw in 1998, and there's been some comparisons made to 1998, but I think it's important to contextualise it in the current moment, but rather a targeting of symbols of state. So we saw the targeting for arson and destruction of parliament buildings throughout the country, of police stations, police buildings, and some other buildings associated in one way or another with the state. And there's been a lot of discussion in Indonesia about who was responsible for this, and there's often what I've argued is a set-piece kind of conspiracy argument, which, like a lot of conspiracies, has an element of truth to it, and that was that this violence was manufactured in some way. If you're listening to government, they say it's manufactured by provocateurs, stirring up young people in particular, directing them to unlawful activity. Conspiracies, the enemies of government, those who undermine Indonesia, and a lot of other rhetoric of those kinds. Now, coming from processes themselves, in particular student and labour leaders, was another set of theories that the shifting of the protest towards that kind of violence was manufactured by elements of state apparatus. And of course, there's histories of state agents infiltrating protests and stirring them up, the argument being that this is done in order to delegitimise them. Now, the thing that I found really interesting was looking, and I wasn't in Jakarta in particular at that time. I just returned back to Australia and was watching it on the many TikTok streams, which were a great source of information until they were shut down, of course, by TikTok. But looking at the composition of the demonstrations, the huge number of young people, and by young people I'm talking about teenagers, from 12 to 16 years old, who were really at the forefront of a lot of the conflict and violence in terms of targeting of state infrastructure. So I think that sort of returning back to the question is an interesting one to think about, I guess, sociologically in terms of why are people violent in particular contexts, and why would this particular demographic, Indonesia being a very young country, and a lot has been discussed around the significant socioeconomic pressures on young Indonesians in terms of the lack of jobs, insecurities, or on a whole number of different fronts. Has that got a relationship to what we saw in those riots, where really a triggering event amplified through Indonesia deeply engaged in social media, horrible footage, which I think everybody saw, of Arfan Kurniawan being hit, and then later dying after being hit by the police car, triggering what was really a significant rage amongst young people. And I think that speaks to these issues around representation, because on one level, if we look at it within the context of analysis of Indonesian institutional politics, what many scholars, and I've also made this argument of forms of democratic regression and the hollowing out of Indonesian democracy. So the argument is that people are less represented within the formal political system, within political parties that are more increasingly resembling cartels, and that this translates into frustration, societal level frustration, and a real increasing disjuncture, particularly as a demographic element to it, of younger people not feeling represented within the formal system. And so moments like that, I think, really you see an eruption of a mix of both rational interests, that people don't feel that their life is getting better, they don't feel that the government is doing taking adequate measures to do it, but also the irrationality of the emotional element of that as well, which often translates into violent behaviour. So, yeah, I think that those sort of protests were interesting because of the demographic component, and this is regardless of the theories. There's probably elements of both of those conspiracies of government at play, but I think that doesn't adequately explain the widespread extent of it, where you saw large numbers of young people giving very targeted violence and suggesting that they don't feel represented. In fact, see the government or symbols of authority with a deep suspicion, if not hostility.
Right. Like I said, it's a complex question. I think you've done a great job in sort of comprehensively outlining the different elements behind it. I think with particular regard to the youth, we know statistically, if you're a young person in Indonesia today, their unemployment rate is the highest. If you look at all the demographic sectors, it's something like 17%, when the national rate is about 4 or 5%. And very few of them have formal jobs. Very few of them have steady paychecks. It's not even living paycheck to paycheck. And the other part of it is social media, the sort of flip side of social media. My drug of choice is X only when I have to watch things like that. I don't go on TikTok if I can avoid it. But it's the immediacy, I think, also of social media, where recently we've heard about, not just recently, but parliamentarians and rich people flaunting their wealth when the typical or ordinary Indonesian has barely enough to get by every day and every month. Just picking up on one little element of what you said earlier, and this is the next question about one of your research interests, and I think a fascinating area probably for our listeners who may not know at all or enough about it. So there's a very particular term, Preman, Preman, roughly loosely translated as gangster. Could you define Preman or gangster politics in Indonesia for our listeners, and how your own research has crystallized what we might know about this everyday state power, right, as it's exercised in Indonesia by these groups and networks of power that you study? So you mentioned it a little bit in that answer just now. This is just delving into a bit more detail on this particular question.
Sure. Well, Preman is kind of a really fascinating term because I think it kind of reflects in some way an organic understanding of power within Indonesian society. So the historical context is that Preman is the Indonesian adaptation of a Dutch word, and my Dutch pronunciation probably completely wrong, but it's vrigman, which means free man in Dutch. And so during the colonial era, the Dutch colonial regime employed a range of privateers who were used to manage populations, engage in forms of coercion, etc. And so they were considered as sort of freed in a sense from some of the elements of colonial rule because they assisted the regime in this way. And also, look at sort of the fantastic work that was done by historians like Robert Cribb, looking at how, if you delve beyond the ideology of the colonial regime, which often represents itself as exercising this kind of complete control, that was never really the case for the Dutch. And that you had pockets of what later became Indonesia that were largely lawless in the sense that they were run by local strongmen. They may have been involved in banditry, in livestock. It was a really common thing during the colonial era. So you've had these figures who've been fundamental to how social and political power has been enacted, but they've not formally incorporated within the institutions of power, starting from the colonial era. And coming into contemporary post-independence Indonesia, local power brokers, local strongmen have been a fundamental feature of social order of different kinds within Indonesia. And the process, without delving into state building theory, has been that rather the process of state building in Indonesia being one of eliminating those groups and constituting legitimate authority only within the formal institutions of state. So coming in Australia, you have the police, you have these formal and other forms of coercive authority are considered essentially illegal or illegitimate in some way. In the Indonesian case, it hasn't been that straightforward. And so you've had this ongoing role of informal power brokers, in everyday politics. The shift in the term Preman has been really interesting because if you look at the 1950s and 1960s and even into the 1970s in Indonesia, the term Preman, one, wasn't as commonly used as it is now, and two, it had a quite specific meaning, and it referred largely to state authorities, particularly the military, when they were in civilian clothes. So if you said, using Indonesian, berpakaian preman, if you're looking like a preman, it meant usually normatively that someone was referring to military or police who were out in their civilian clothes. Now, if we go through the New Order period, Hartfeld, from the late 60s, early 70s, up until the 1990s, the shift in the normative use of preman headed towards an identification of it with criminality. And some, in my own work, and Lauren Reiter did significant work on this in the early 90s. He did a lot of work on Pemuda Pancasila, looked at the ways in which this criminal kinds of coercive behaviour, so racketeering, extortion, ruling in the sense local economies in a quite brutal or authoritarian way, not a social contract, but ruling through coercion, became instituted within how power operated. So rather than the New Order state seeking to eliminate Preman, which it did with other things, it eliminated independent trade unions, it eliminated all kinds of social organisation that was considered as maybe threatening in some way. It engaged in modes of organising local, some cases criminal elements, strong men, standover men, as a part of how state power operated, and that they would have relationships, personal relationships, patronage relationships with formal power, and some cases became quite powerful. So this sort of Preman figure has been both an element of how power has operated in everyday life in Indonesia, but it's also, for many people, linked to an experience of criminality, of being intimidated, coerced, businesses in particular subjected to, illicit rent seeking and other things. So Preman have been a really interesting phenomena. I kind of became interested in it through my own early experience in Indonesia, where I learned pencaksilat, Indonesian martial arts, and the world of martial arts has often been intertwined with those cultures of hypermasculinity, of local strongmen, and I became really intrigued about this kind of link, partly through my own experience in my martial arts school with some of my teachers were what we would refer to as not preman, but jagoan. So they were influential members of their community, linked to what was seen as their prowess and their capacities, to fight, but also as people who had lots of different links. So they had links to the military. They knew different people. And so on the one hand, while they were intimidatory and often coercive, they were also figures within communities or neighbourhoods who linked everyday people to power. They could broker relationships. They knew different people. They knew about different things happening in different parts of the city that made them kind of important figures to connect in different kinds of ways. So they're a figure, I think, of, even if normatively now Preman in most people, in many Indonesian minds, means gangster. It means criminal. I think sociologically you still see these figures as quite interesting figures in how everyday governance operates outside of institutionalist approaches and the formal arms of government. So that's been something that's really fascinated me for quite some time, and it's changed over time. It's still very much a feature of Indonesian politics now. And in fact, I think under Prabowo, there's a long history from his military career of engaging with these kind of figures as a part of a particular approach to both rule and military strategies. They're still very relevant to understanding Indonesia today.
Actually, when I was listening to you, other than thinking it's a good PhD topic for someone, and I also thought of Cribb's Gangsters and Revolutionaries, that book. But it reminds me also of triads. So in Singapore, in Hong Kong, in a lot of the Chinese majority countries, especially in the earlier years, you also have that negotiation of power when this is before the state has fully, if you will, taken over control of all the levers of power. And I suspect in Indonesia, it's a project that may never be finished. The state as the legitimate authority that holds power. That's a very hard thing to do when it's an archipelago, when it's a big population, but also when you have these competing centers of power. So that is fascinating. So now that we've gone through the first two questions, I think a lot of people who look at Indonesia today under Prabowo, and you sort of hinted at that a little bit in the last part of your answer just now. This question is about what happened in Indonesia in the late 1990s, around the time of Suharto's fall. So say 1997, when the Asian financial crisis happened on 2nd July, all the way through to when he stepped down as president in May 1998, and the protests and the students, being very upset. A lot of people are asking what similarities or differences there are in Indonesian politics between what we saw in the late 90s versus today. You can answer it just narrowly in terms of the exercise and use of power, right? Or you can, if you want, take a sort of big view and say, is it different? So my sort of basic argument, at least today, is it is different. It has shades of what happened, but I don't think we're there yet. The country is a different country in some ways. In many ways, it's similar to what it was, but I think in some ways the practice and use of power is a bit different. The electorate is also more educated, not uniformly, but louder because they have social media and they have ways of immediately getting the attention of the world if they needed to. And also the current president happens to be rather actually an internationally minded one who cares what he looks like within limits on the international stage. Yeah. It's a tough question.
I'm trying to think where to start.
Yeah, it's a big one.
Well, look, I mean, and there has been quite a few comparisons made in recent months after we saw, what I call the August upheaval, and are there parallels to be drawn with 1998? I'm a little bit wary of that. One, because what happened in 1998 was the product of very specific circumstances at the time, and it was a slow pressure cooker moment where you'd had increasing disillusionment with the Suharto regime across different sectors of Indonesian society. That was really the trigger point was the economic collapse, where the middle class that had been one of the successors of Suharto's regime. You had a middle class who were largely, in many respects, ambivalent to some of the authoritarian elements of Suharto because they'd financially prospered. They lost everything almost overnight. And so you saw a very rapid unraveling of the legitimacy of Suharto and a very clear focus as well to the protest movements at the time. There's a broad agreement from everyone from far left student groups through to relatively conservative Islamic organisations that they all wanted Suharto to go. And so there was a coherence there as a response to authoritarianism. What came next, I don't think anyone had any agreement at that time, and it played out as it did. What we see today is quite a different Indonesia, as you said. We have a generation of young people who have grown up in post-authoritarian Indonesia. Indonesia is not a liberal democracy, and it's had its challenges, and I think we might maybe talk about that in a moment. But I think there's a generation of young people who have particular kinds of deep assumptions about politics, which are different from previous.
Could you name some?
I think to say that they're more democratic, I'm not sure that's probably the best way to discuss it. But I think there's certain assumptions about a nominal democratic process and the idea that Indonesia is a democracy of a kind. And I know some scholars have written about how young people are quite ambivalent to democracy, but I kind of tend to think can be a bit chicken and egg. The ambivalence can be because you just assume something is there, right? And it's a different mindset to, say, an activist generation. And I know some of the activists of 98 who are now, of course, academics or even senior policy makers may see it as slightly differently. But I think there's been particular kinds of a generation that's grown up in that period where Indonesia's had elections. Indonesia's been quite unique in many respects, where it's had voluntary elections. You're not saying like in Australia, you're required by law to vote. Indonesia, you're not, but it's had one of the highest participation rates of the OECD constantly, and that's despite a lot of cynicism that it's corruption and it doesn't lead to but people are deeply invested in that process, and I think that's something which is widespread, particularly in younger people. One of the things that really, and it goes back to where my response to your first question, I think it almost feels like there's quite a demographic divide between power and then a very young population. And you have particularly someone like Prabowo, who is a new order man through and through. He's what I refer to as his inert crystallization period, where his core ideas around the world were formed. And I think we all probably have those in one way or another. It was during the New Order. So his logics, his reflexes in politics are shaped by a different era. And I think despite, his campaigning where, the last campaign where there was a very overt pitch to appeal to a different, younger Indonesia, I think his political logics remain the same. I don't think they're shared by a lot of younger Indonesians. They're deeply networked. They're deeply global in their experience and their worldview. They're very sophisticated, and I think, despite formal education or otherwise, I think there's young people in Indonesia are very savvy, and you see that. In Australia, when it comes to politics, I always say don't read the comments when it comes to social media because they always make me feel depressed. But in the Indonesian case, I say always read the comments, and you'll just see just very sharp, very clever, very astute understandings of how power operate. I think that's a bit of a tension point almost, where you have an administration that's arguably heading in a more autocratic direction, reflecting, particularly in Prabowo's case, his logics and his ideas. I think he's deeply ideological in many respects, his idea of what Indonesia should be. And then a younger Indonesia where people don't necessarily have a coherent ideology or political view, because really that's not a part of Indonesian politics. But they have senses of how things should be done. And I think things like August really brought that to the surface and just showed just a real disjuncture, a real gap between government and this younger population. Diverse, of course. I'm not trying to sort of say youth are all, this sort of coherent category, because they're not. But I think that's sort of an interesting observation. And that all of that's quite different to 1998. We had this build-up over decades of a regime that was becoming more corrupt, more nepotistic, more incapable of delivering things to Indonesian society. And then, of course, the economic crisis of 97 just blew it all apart very quickly. I think this is more a case of a younger Indonesian population who've grown up in a post-authoritarian Indonesia, a flawed democracy, but a democracy nonetheless. And they're having they're kind of rubbing against an administration that's still reflecting older logics of power and, in some respects, older ideas of what Indonesia is. I think that's quite different from 1998. And I have a lot of friends from the 98 generation, and I think sometimes there's a tendency to sentimentalise that era and project it onto the present, but I think really there's quite fundamentally different social dynamics at play.
I think that's a great way to sort of think about it. And as you were talking, I think one of the shifts is, in a way, it's a normative shift for the younger generation. We expect elections. We know they will be flawed, but hey, democracy as a concept is flawed. And I think the other point about them being savvy, right? And I think a lot of that savvy, we saw that in the wake of the death of Afan. I saw the video on X, and immediately even the region, right? So the diaspora, Indonesians in the diaspora, and also non-Indonesians in the region were sending supplies and food to the protesters and the other ojek drivers via Grab. They figured out a way to bypass country control. So there's a certain intelligence, if you will, in that younger generation that maybe are frustrated because they don't have the levers of power, and they're watching these people from a different era do things in a way that they may not particularly want to support 100%. Which leads us to the next question. So I suppose I'll rephrase it. We sort of drafted it, but whether or not you want to talk about it, I guess it might be too depressing. What do you think are some of the most... I'm an optimist by nature, so yeah.
I'm professionally optimistic.
Are you? Okay.
Professionally.
What are some of the more serious indications of democratic regression in the past decade or so? So that might be a too long a period, but I think if we start from, say, Widodo term 2 into now, and I didn't add this to the question, but do you see that sort of trending up? More regression as we keep going into the second and third and fourth year of the first term of this president?
Can I just say something briefly about the youth thing?
Yes.
Because I forgot to mention it. We could and I'll just start from now.
Oh, bisa, yeah.
Okay. I think another thing that was really interesting, if we looked at the August protests, and we saw prior to it, for example, the One Piece flag as a symbol. And when I first saw that, I was like, what is that? And I asked my son, who's 27 years old, he said, oh, One Piece, I love One Piece. He doesn't know anything about Indonesian politics other than what I tell him, but he knew what One Piece was. He says, One Piece. I said, well, can you tell me the broad gist of it? Oh, there's a corrupt regime, a corrupt system, corrupt people, and then there's sort of a tension between those who don't want that. And it was interesting to see it, not just in the Indonesian context, but we saw it in Nepal, of course, where we saw a upheaval by young people that overthrew the administration. We saw it in Bangladesh, and we saw, a similar phenomenon to what's happened in Indonesia and other parts of the world, rallying not around a coherent ideology, so, a left critique or anything, but around popular culture engagements of sentiments of ideas of how power is and how it should be. And I think that speaks to a lot of things that aren't necessarily positive. There's a lot of political atomization. There isn't the forms of social organisation and political organisation that we may have seen in other eras, and I think it's more difficult to do in the world we live in today just because of it's such a fragmented social and political field. But nonetheless, there is a momentum there. I sort of take some optimism from that, even if it is kind of it doesn't take the shape or form of different eras. And I'm being quite critical of some colleagues from that generation who sort of tend to finger wave at younger people on those grounds. But they need to understand it's just such a fundamentally different social economic context in which they live, and I think they're trying to negotiate it in the sort of best way that they can.
Yeah, I agree with that. And the whole One Piece phenomenon, yes, I've had many conversations in the last few months leading to people who have never watched One Piece and don't know what it is.
Well, I've subsequently watched it, and I think it's great. And you can see how it can become a kind of a symbolic moral frame, which popular culture often is for interpreting the world that people are living in. I think that's really interesting.
And actually, to your point about the agenda may be amorphous and may not be if you will a leader of the youth at this point, which is a point yesterday we had Max Lane and Yanwa Nugroho on a panel yesterday in a public seminar, and that's the point that Max was making, right? That there's a lot of cacophony, there's a lot of noise, especially in social media. There's a lot of dialogues, there's a lot of these forums assessing democracy in Indonesia, but there doesn't seem to be a leader. No one seems to be standing up to say, I will lead you out of this, or I will lead you and go against this that you're not happy with. But a lot of people are not happy, but there's no sort of, right now at least, not yet, there's no, or maybe not ever, but.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, there's tend to be assumption, one, and I might maybe disagree with Max on some of this, that there needs to be a leader. And I think one of the things that's interesting, and it reflects, the world that we live in, there's a networked society that I think doesn't tend towards those kinds of collective organisation that we may have seen in other eras. Now, I mean, on one level, that's a problem, but on another level, it's only a problem if you maintain your previous ways of thinking about how change can occur. And I think if we're going to be optimistic about it, we can see that there's a lot of potential there. There's a lot of different things going on. They don't coordinate with one another, and I don't think that's going to change just because of the nature of life in 2025 society, particularly in a country like Indonesia, which is so diverse in lots of different sorts of ways. But there is a momentum there. Maybe if I can then respond to the next question. I mean, the challenge is, I think, when you look at the sort of broader political shifts at the elite level in terms of national politics, and I think it's important to not identify national politics with all politics in Indonesia, because I think, so the currents that we see amongst young people, I think there's a lot of interesting things going on. Elite politics is heading in the same direction it has really for the past decade or so, where a lot of democratic transition theorists, I don't count myself as one of those, got very excited, I think, particularly during the early Yudhoyono years, that we were seeing Indonesia transition into something that they could identify as a broadly, maybe even liberal-orientated democracy. And that certainly, I don't think was ever the case, but it certainly hasn't been the case. And what we've seen, I think, is a trend towards increasing autocratization. And so Indonesia has elections, and they're held fairly, by those kinds of normative standards. The problem is, from a democratic point of view, that process is stripped of substance in terms of distinct forms of representations for different interests and desires of the Indonesian population, particular kinds of changes, and the consolidation of political cartels. And that's something that, was initiated by Jokowi, and Prabowo is continuing on. I mean, Prabowo is often called a lot of different things. I think if you return to some of the older theorizing that we saw around the New Order, he's an integralist. He believes in the idea of the integralist state. And the integralist state was the idea that Suharto really embodied of the state as the family, and that everyone was a part of the family, unless you decided to be an murtad and be outside of the family, in which case, you would face significant repercussions. And his approach to ruling has been the big tent idea. And that often appeals to people, particularly in Indonesia, where there's a lot of tropes around, of unity and togetherness, etc. But of course, that idea is sort of antithetical to the idea of a democratic system based around, notions of an opposition, of contesting ideas, of often fierce debate over policy and the direction of the country. And he's made it very clear he doesn't think that opposition is a part of the Indonesian way. And so how do you approach that? Well, you can approach that really in two ways. One is to be repressive and to repress those voices that you don't like. And some have argued there's been an uptick in that in different ways, though it's mitigated by the fact that he needs to have legitimacy and being an iron fist. This isn't going to work in Indonesia in 2025 like it may have in the 1990s. And the second has been to incorporate everybody. So he came to power saying, I'm going to have every political party and every group, social organisations like Nahdlatul Ulama, etc., as a part of government. We're all going to be a part of this together. And so the way you eliminate opposition is by making everyone a part of this vast coalition, and then ruling then becomes a matter of managing that, divvying up projects, making everyone happy in one way or another, and hoping it holds together. Now, from a democratic point of view, it means that the ideas of societal representation almost disappear entirely, and it's a different set of logics. I don't think it's a scheme. I just think that really you have a political elite that's driven by different ideas about what power is, of what Indonesia's political system should look like, and they're older ideas. So I think we're seeing that play out with Prabowo, who really, again, is a product of a different generation. He's obsessed with being president for 20 years. Has finally got to where he wants to be. And so on one hand, he's enjoying the limelight, and he's very comfortable on the international stage and likes to perform there as a statesman representing Indonesia as a growing power and a growing player in global affairs. But domestically, adopting an older idea of how democracy should look and operate in Indonesia. And it's not one of a contest of ideas. It's not one of having an opposition and a government with the dynamic that we may see in other more liberal democratic systems. It's an integralist idea.
Yeah, Made has also done some work, Made Supriyatna, on that as well, and I think that idea will come back again and again when we look at this presidency. So we're going to shift for the sort of last substantive question to one of your other research interests. You've done a lot of work on urban poverty, and arguably in this kind of democracy, again, these are voices of people who may be disenfranchised or may not have access to power and access to the right people, right, to get what they want out of life. What do you see as the implications if urban poverty, especially in Jakarta, the current capital, maybe the forever capital if Nusantara never takes off?
It's looking that way.
What do you think the implications are on the country, right? So if the issue, and maybe not just in Jakarta, but if the issue of urban poverty is not seriously and adequately addressed by the national government, where would Indonesia go, right? This particular marginalized group, which does include youth, many children and young people.
The work that I've done on urban poverty in the past, I had a long project I did with the colleagues at Murdoch, Jane Hutchison and Caroline Hughes, and we looked at the political agency of the urban poor in Southeast Asia. And our basic theoretical approach is based in critical political economy, where we were interested in how thinking about poverty not just as kind of income measures and the sort of what I call the World Banky idea of poverty, but seeing poverty as a social relation that's constitutive of the conditions that constitute poverty. So in short, poverty is an outcome of particular structural forces, and our argument was that shapes people's political agency in distinct ways. And what we wanted to try and do in that project was to look at the political agency of urban poor populations on their own terms. How do they engage in poverty? How do they negotiate all the impediments and difficulties that they face as poor people? And one of the, if you take a social relational approach as we did, one of the key features of poverty is that they have to rely on more powerful people for many of the basic necessities of life. And to do that, requires an approach to politics that in many respects is often invisible as politics to those from other social classes, including, we argue, from many middle and upper middle class academics who see not political agency, but passivity or a whole range of other things, and the different ways that poor people have often been characterised in the past. And so one of the things that we sort of took away from that work is that urban poor, the politics of urban poor people is highly sophisticated. It's constant, partly because being poor means that you're constantly having to negotiate, to strategize, and to think in complex ways about how to fulfill your basic needs in a circumstance where you don't have social capital, where you don't usually have access to power and resources, and you don't have the luxuries, say, of other social classes that may be able to engage in long form, say, ideological or principle-based political projects. And so returning sort of back to your question, where we look at, the economic circumstances in Indonesia, where job precarity is now the norm. And that, I think, was very much reflected in the protests. We saw, emblematic of the new economy in Indonesia is Grab drivers, Gojek, and all of those, many of whom, as I know the many conversations I've had, are often highly educated. A university degree doesn't necessarily lead to social mobility in the same way that it did in the past.
Even a PhD.
Absolutely. And so those guarantees, and that's not just an Indonesia specific thing. We see that in Australia. We see it in many countries where young people, a lot of the sort of pathways to social and class mobility have disappeared, or they've just become less predictable. So in that context, you have a very destabilizing set of circumstances where people are living in conditions of uncertainty, and conditions of uncertainty in terms of how you look at politics or how you engage politically. If I talk about politics in terms of a sociological sense rather than sort of a normative institutional sense, is that people are always looking to establish relationships with different sets of actors that will help them, to get by and to prosper in one way or another. I think, returning to the earlier discussion, it means programmatic politics, so ideological politics, is more difficult because people are very much focused on trying to negotiate, and we call that politics, negotiate to get by.
Survival.
Yeah, absolutely. And in urban context and, urban Indonesia, a place like Jakarta, dense populations, people living very in close proximity, very heterogeneous neighbourhoods. We argue that's a distinct form of politics in and of itself, where people are constantly calibrating different strategies, trying to engage in multiple sets of relationships with all sorts of different actors, of the police through to Preman, through to other different groups, to negotiate, making a life and hopefully making progress or prospering in some kind of way. But that doesn't translate into social movements, for example, in the same way we've seen in the past. So trade unions in Indonesia are quite large, but trade unions really in many respects, reflect an economy or a type of economy that's increasingly disappearing, where people have shared workplaces on a scale and shared sets of work conditions that form the basis, for organisation around improvement of conditions. And that's much more difficult to do. And so I think the kind of politics of the urban poor that we looked at, and that project was sort of about 10 years ago that we started. But those structural conditions are shaping new kinds of political agency, and that was sort of the core argument that we made. And we need to look at political agency in that sort of way.
It's great. It's sort of both inspiring and slightly depressing at the same time. But I think the point about survival, and I think what it is now is, you mentioned a bit about the middle class. The middle class in Indonesia is shrinking, and people's options are shrinking, and I think that's what the anger is about as well. I'm not progressing, but I don't even think my children, and their children, if they have any, will progress. And I think that's where the rubber hits the road. We'll close on what I like to think of as the Shavasana question. This is a nice, easy one, hopefully. I asked this of most of my guests so far on the podcast, to tell our audience, especially the younger scholars and younger listeners, how you got started doing your research that you do today. We were just reflecting on your career, almost 3 decades looking at Indonesia, if you count the time. Adoy, sudah lama. How has your own research agenda evolved? What keeps you going every day?
Okay, well, my interest in Indonesia goes back to my childhood. I won't necessarily ponder there too long because we'll be here for too long. Where I used to spend a lot of time in Indonesia with my parents, travelling around, and that left a big impression on me. I returned to Indonesia as a teenager, travelling around, and that intersected with my own political activism at that time. And from the early 90s, I made contact with what was the proto-anti-Suharto movement, a number of activists who became very good friends. And at the same time, I had an alternative set of interests where I studied Indonesian martial arts, pencaksilat, very seriously for quite some time.
You can say black belt.
Well, actually, in most pencaksilat, black is the lowest level. So I did set up a branch of my school, Taji Malela, which is from Bandung, and I taught it for a while in Australia and did the competitive thing. But I was very interested in that culturally and also politically, and sort of, I guess, some of the interesting, what I like to think would been interesting for me in terms of my research, in terms of the stuff on Preman, etc., emerged out of, I guess, those two, on one level, divergent interests, but sort of looking at some of the crossovers there. So I was very much involved as a young activist with supporting the Indonesian democracy movement in the 1990s, and still have some friends. They've gone on to do very diverse things, some of whom have been in the current administration as well. That interest in social and political change in Indonesia, but then also, I guess, the interest in cultural politics, which translated, I guess, in my academic work over time into theorising and an interest in everyday politics, and how social relations, etc., at that local level are a unique and important form of politics. I'd say the building blocks of all politics. I tend to think sometimes there's an over-focus on elite machinations, and dismissing societal level things, as either passive or reactive. But I've been deeply interested in that, remembering also that Indonesian history has been driven by people-based movements, and I think that's still the case and will be the case going forward. So that's been my sort of prevailing interest. It's never boring in Indonesia, as you know, on that front. There's always interesting developments, and there's always things, despite, I think, and these aren't unique to Indonesia, the global atmosphere at the moment is grim in many respects, but there's lots of sparks of life, so to speak, in terms of, the enthusiasm and engagement of young people.
Oh, the protests in everywhere. Madagascar.
Yeah, I think it's important to sometimes adopt that broader view and see that there's this big pool of young generations who want things to be different. And
we're all waving the one piece flag.
yeah, I can imagine it would be one piece that could be the rallying point, but yes, so be it. That's interesting in and of itself. So yeah, I mean that's where my interest grew out of that involvement in activism, and I was very involved in the East Timor solidarity movement as well, and in particular linkages between that in Australia and Indonesia. It's how I met many of my activist friends in Indonesia, because they were some of the few who were supporting East Timorese independence in the 1990s, and I studied in Indonesia, and that sort of grew out from there effectively.
Do you have any advice if you want to give for a young scholar today looking at Indonesia?
I mean, it's a bit of a cliche. I say this to a lot of my students: is just follow what interests you. Academia in particular is fraught with trends, and some of them, are interesting, some of them are not. But I think the really interesting work comes when people find something that really triggers their interest. They connect dots between things that may not necessarily come across as related, and it's the basis for a lot of good research-based work, and to do work where you talk to people. That seems a bit of a trite thing to say, but I think it's important when we have big data-driven research, and look, that's valuable in its own way, but I think it's really important as well to have work that focuses on relating to people and talking to people, and that kind of approach. And of course, that's always, for me, a great joy in Indonesia, getting to speak to so many different kinds of people who are always, for the most part, incredibly generous in their time and their hospitality. And that's one of the things that I think is, if you're working on Indonesia, for young scholars to do that.
As a fellow pro-qualitative methods person,
absolutely,
or mixed methods person, setuju, 100%.
We need our own one-piece flag for
methods. That'll be a time for another podcast. Thank you so much, Ian, for the just wide-ranging and complex answers you had. Very considered to our questions, and I think this will be a conversation that does not stop. It will keep getting more complex as we watch this new generation come of age in today's Indonesia. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us in our conversation on Dialogues at Fulcrum. If you want to access more of our analysis on Southeast Asia, please check out fulcrum.sg. Dialogues at Fulcrum is brought to you by the ISIS Yusof Ishak Institute. We look forward to sharing more insightful conversations with you in subsequent episodes. See you then!